The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania hills like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip. On the 3rd day of July, 1863, Colonel James Marshall stood beside his bay stallion, Thunder, watching the animal's ears flick nervously as distant cannon fire rumbled across the Gettysburg countryside. The horse's muscles trembled beneath his dark coat, but his hooves remained planted firmly in the muddy earth beside the stone wall where Marshall's cavalry regiment had taken position. "Come on, boy," Marshall whispered, tugging gently at the reins. Thunder had carried him through 2 years of war, from Bull Run to Antietam, never once refusing to charge when ordered. But now, as Confederate General Robert Edward Lee's Army of Northern Virginia prepared for what would become known as Pickett's Charge, the usually dependable warhorse stood as immovable as the granite boulders scattered across the battlefield. The colonel's aide, Lieutenant William Hayes, approached with a worried expression etched across his youthful face. "Sir, General Buford's orders came through. We're to support the infantry line at Cemetery Ridge within the hour." Hayes glanced at Thunder, whose wild eyes rolled white with each thunderclap of artillery. "Perhaps another mount, sir." Marshall shook his head firmly. Thunder wasn't just any horse. He was a survivor, bred from the finest Virginia stock and trained by the colonel himself. They had become an inseparable team, reading each other's thoughts in the heat of battle. The idea of riding another animal into what promised to be the bloodiest confrontation of the war felt like betrayal as the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist to reveal the full scope of the Confederate forces massing across the field. Marshall grew increasingly desperate. He tried every trick he knew, sugar cubes from his personal rations, gentle stroking along Thunder's neck, even the firm commands that had worked during training. Nothing moved the animal from his spot. Other cavalrymen rode past, some casting curious glances at the colonel's predicament, but most focused on their own preparations for the coming storm. The sound of musket fire began to intensify from the direction of Cemetery Hill, where Union forces under General George Gordon Meade had established their defensive positions. According to reports from the American Battlefield Trust archives, this battle would involve the largest number of casualties of the entire war and proved to be its turning point. Marshall could feel the weight of history pressing down upon him, yet here he stood, unable to join the fight because of one stubborn horse. Time was running short. In the distance, he could see the Confederate battle lines forming thousands of gray-clad soldiers, preparing for the massive infantry assault that General Lee hoped would break the Union center. The colonel's regiment was supposed to be in position to exploit any breakthrough, but without Thunder, Marshall felt lost and incomplete. The horse had become more than just his mount. He was his partner, his anchor in the chaos of war. As frustration mounted, Marshall noticed a small figure moving through the camp behind him. A girl, no more than 12 years old, picked her way carefully between the soldiers and their equipment. Her dress was patched and faded, her shoes worn thin with holes that revealed bare toes beneath. She carried a small basket, likely selling bread or water to the troops. But something about her gentle manner caught the colonel's attention. The girl approached slowly, her eyes fixed not on Marshall but on Thunder. She seemed unafraid of the large animal, despite his obvious agitation. When she spoke, her voice was soft and clear, cutting through the morning air like a silver bell. "He's scared," she said simply, reaching out a small hand toward Thunder's muzzle. "They all are." Colonel Marshall turned to study the child more carefully. Her hair, the color of autumn wheat, was braided simply and hung over one shoulder. Despite her ragged appearance, there was something almost ethereal about her presence, as if she belonged to another world entirely. The soldiers around them seemed to fade into the background as she approached Thunder with the confidence of someone who understood horses in ways that went beyond mere training. "Miss, you shouldn't be here," Marshall said gently, though he made no move to send her away. "This is no place for a child." "The battle, I know about the battle," she replied, never taking her eyes off Thunder. "I know about all the battles. The horses remember them long after the men forget." She stepped closer to the stallion, who surprisingly didn't shy away from her approach. Instead, Thunder's ears pricked forward with interest, his wild eyes beginning to calm. Lieutenant Hayes shifted uncomfortably beside his colonel. "Sir, perhaps we should escort the young lady to safety. General Lee's artillery will begin the bombardment soon." And the girl raised her hand slightly, a gesture so simple yet commanding that both officers fell silent. She began to hum, a melody so soft it seemed to blend with the morning breeze. Itself, the tune was unfamiliar to Marshall, yet somehow ancient, carrying within it the echo of countless lullabies sung to frightened children throughout history. Thunder's ears swiveled toward the sound, his head lowering slightly as tension began to leave his powerful frame. The girl continued her gentle song, words in a language Marshall didn't recognize, though their meaning seemed to transcend the need for understanding. Other horses in the vicinity began to settle as well, their riders looking around in surprise, as animals that had been stamping and snorting only moments before became still and attentive. "What is that song?" Marshall asked quietly, not wanting to break the spell that seemed to be weaving itself around them. The girl smiled at expression, both wise and innocent. "It's very old. My grandmother taught it to me, and her grandmother taught it to her. It speaks to the part of them that remembers running free before men taught them to carry death on their backs." She reached out and placed her palm flat against Thunder's neck. The great stallion sighed deeply, a sound of release that seemed to come from his very soul. As the melody continued, Marshall found himself thinking about his own connection to Thunder. He remembered the day he had first seen the colt, barely weaned, in the paddock of his family's estate in Virginia. There had been something special about the animal even then, a spirit that seemed to burn brighter than the others. Marshall had spent countless hours training him, not with harsh bits and spurs, but with patience and understanding. They had become partners in the truest sense, each complementing the other's strengths. But war had changed them both. Marshall had seen things that no gentleman should witness, had given orders that haunted his dreams, and Thunder had carried him through it all, never questioning, always faithful. Perhaps the horse's refusal to move wasn't stubbornness at all, but wisdom, a recognition that this day would bring a horror beyond anything they had previously faced. The girl's song began to fade, though her hand remained on Thunder's neck. "He's not refusing because he's afraid," she said softly, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed far beyond her years. "He's trying to protect you. He knows what's coming." A chill ran down Marshall's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What do you mean?" Before the girl could answer, a tremendous roar erupted from across the battlefield. The Confederate artillery had begun their bombardment, over 150 cannons unleashing their fury upon the Union positions. The sound was deafening, like the very earth splitting apart, and smoke began to rise in great black clouds from Cemetery Ridge. Thunder tensed again at the sound, but he didn't bolt. Instead, he seemed to be listening to something beyond the cannon fire, his head tilted as if hearing a voice that only he could perceive. The girl nodded, as if she understood. "The battle will be terrible," she said, her words somehow audible. "Despite the chaos around them, many brave souls will cross over today. But there's something else coming, something that will require both courage and wisdom to face." Marshall wanted to ask what she meant, but the urgency of the moment was pressing. Upon him, his regiment was supposed to be moving into position, and every minute of delay could cost lives. Yet he found himself trusting this strange child in a way that defied explanation. The bombardment continued with relentless fury, each explosion sending tremors through the ground beneath their feet. Colonel Marshall watched as Union batteries responded in kind, their shots arcing over the battlefield like deadly meteors. Through the growing smoke and chaos, he could see his fellow officers gesturing frantically, trying to coordinate their forces for the assault that everyone knew was coming. Thunder stood quietly now, though his ears remained alert to every sound. The girl had not moved from his side, her small hand still resting against his neck, as if she were drawing some kind of strength from the connection. In the midst of the thunderous artillery duel, she began to speak again, her voice somehow carrying, clearly despite the cacophony around them. "I've seen him before," she said, looking up at Marshall with eyes that seemed far older than her years should have allowed. "In the field at Antietam, when the corn was red with more than autumn, he carried you through the smoke when Colonel Richardson fell." Marshall's breath caught in his throat. The Battle of Antietam had been fought nearly a year ago, and the memory of that terrible September day still haunted his dreams. Thunder had indeed carried him through the deadly cornfield where so many brave men had fallen. But how could this child know such details? "You weren't there," he said quietly, studying her face for any sign of deception. "You couldn't have been." The girl smiled sadly. "I'm always there, in one form or another. Someone has to sing for the horses when their riders can no longer hear them." She began to hum again, and Marshall realized that the melody was the same, one he had heard thunder whinnying softly during the long night after Antietam, when the stallion had stood guard over wounded soldiers in a makeshift field hospital. Lieutenant Hayes approached cautiously, his face pale with concern. "Colonel, General Buford's compliments, but he needs to know our position. The Confederate charge is forming up," and he stopped mid-sentence, staring at the girl with a puzzled expression. "Sir, do you see her too?" Marshall nodded slowly, relief flooding through him. For a moment, he had wondered if the stress of command had finally broken his mind. "You can see her, Hayes." "Yes, sir, but—" Hayes shook his head as if trying to clear it. "She reminds me of someone. My sister, perhaps, though Mary died of fever when we were children." He paused, his voice becoming distant. "She used to sing to our horses during thunderstorms." The girl turned her attention to the young lieutenant, her expression gentle and understanding. "She's still singing," she said simply. "You just learned to stop listening." As if to emphasize her words, a massive explosion erupted nearby, close, enough to shower them with dirt and debris. Most of the horses in the vicinity shied violently, but Thunder remained steady, his eyes fixed on the girl as if she were an anchor in the storm of war. Through the smoke and chaos, Marshall began to make out the Confederate battle lines forming across the field. Thousands of men in gray and butternut uniforms were arranging themselves in parade ground formation, their bayonets glinting in the filtered sunlight. General George Edward Pickett's division was taking its position on the right, while James, Johnston, Pettigrew's and Isaac Ridgway, Trimble's divisions formed the center and left of the massive assault force. 15,000 men, Marshall murmured, awed by the sheer scale of what he was witnessing. Lee's gambling everything on this charge. The girl nodded gravely, and most of them won't see another sunset, but their courage will echo through the ages, just as thunders will. She looked up at the stallion, who nickered softly in response. He knows he has a different role to play today. As the Confederate artillery began to slacken, preparing for the infantry assault, Marshall felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He had experienced this feeling before every major engagement, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and the terrible weight of responsibility. But this time, there was something else. A sense that he was standing at the crossroads of history itself. The girl seemed to sense his thoughts. "Every battle is a crossroads," she said softly. "Every choice echoes forward and backward through time. But this day will be remembered when all the participants have returned to dust." Thunder suddenly lifted his head, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Without warning, he took a step forward, then another. The girl smiled and removed her hand from his neck, stepping back with a graceful movement that seemed almost like a dance. "He's ready now," she said to Marshall. "But remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it. Both of you will need to remember that before this day is done." The artillery bombardment ceased with an abruptness that seemed to make the very air ring with silence. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the battlefield held its breath, as if all of creation were pausing to witness what was about to unfold. Then, across the mile-wide expanse of open ground, the Confederate battle cry began to rise, a sound like the howling of wolves, or the keening of the wind through ancient mountains. Colonel Marshall swung into Thunder's saddle with practiced ease, feeling the familiar strength of the stallion beneath him. The horse's earlier reluctance had completely vanished, replaced by an alertness that seemed to vibrate through every muscle. Whatever the girl had done, whatever understanding had passed between them, Thunder was now ready for battle. "Regiment, prepare to advance." Marshall called out, his voice carrying across the ranks of mounted soldiers who had been waiting for this moment. Sabers rang as they were drawn from scabbards, and the morning sun caught the steel in brilliant flashes that seemed to mirror the lightning of the previous night's storm. Lieutenant Hayes rode up beside him, his young face set with determination, despite the fear that Marshall could see in his eyes. "Orders, sir." "We follow General Farnsworth's brigade in support of the main assault," Marshall replied, though he found himself glancing back toward where the girl had been standing. She was nowhere to be seen, having vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. Only the lingering echo of her song remained, carried on the morning breeze like a half-remembered dream. Across the field, the Confederate lines began to move. 15,000 men stepped off together, their ranks dressed as if they were on parade rather than walking into the mouth of hell. The sight was both magnificent and terrible. A human wave rolling across the Pennsylvania countryside with flags flying and officers on horseback calling out encouragement to their men. Thunder danced beneath Marshall, his energy barely contained. Now that he had been given purpose, the colonel could feel the horse's anticipation, a mirror of his own mixture of dread and duty. This was what they had trained for, what the entire war had been building toward, a single, decisive moment that would determine the fate of the nation. The Union artillery opened fire when the Confederate advance reached the halfway point. Solid shot and canister tore through the advancing ranks like an invisible scythe, cutting down men with casual efficiency. Marshall watched in horror and fascination as gaps appeared in the grey lines, only to be filled by the men behind, who, stepped over the bodies of their fallen comrades without breaking stride. "My God," Hayes whispered beside him. "Look at them come." Indeed, despite the devastating fire they were receiving, the Confederate assault maintained its momentum. General Lewis Addison, Armistead's brigade, identifiable by their general's hat, held high on the point of his sword, pushed forward with remarkable determination. Behind them came Pickett's other brigades, their battle flags streaming in the wind as they approached the stone wall that marked the Union defensive line. Thunder began to move forward without any command from Marshall, as if the horse had decided that the time for waiting was over. The colonel gave the stallion his head, trusting in the wisdom that the mysterious girl had somehow awakened in his mount. Around them, the cavalry regiment began to advance, their mission to exploit any breakthrough that the infantry might achieve. But even as they rode forward, Marshall could see that something was going wrong with the Confederate assault. The artillery fire was taking a terrible toll, and the Union infantry behind the stone wall were rising to deliver devastating volleys of musket fire. The grey ranks were beginning to waver, their perfect formation dissolving into clusters of men seeking whatever cover they could find in the open field. A few Confederate soldiers, led by Armistead himself, actually reached the Union line and briefly broke through. For a moment, it seemed as if Lee's desperate gamble might succeed. But the breakthrough was too narrow, too lightly held, and Union reinforcements quickly sealed the gap. Armistead fell, mortally wounded, with his hand on a Union cannon, his hat still impaled on his sword beside him. Thunder slowed as they approached the area where Union and Confederate forces were locked in desperate hand-to-hand combat. The horse seemed to sense that this was not the time for a cavalry charge, but rather for something else entirely. Marshall found himself remembering the girl's words about courage and wisdom, and he began to understand what she had meant. The Confederate assault was failing. Even from his position, Marshall could see the grey tide beginning to ebb as survivors started the long walk back across the field they had crossed with such hope only minutes before. The ground was littered with the bodies of brave men who would never see their homes again, and the air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. It was then that Thunder made a decision that would have seemed impossible only hours before. Instead of charging toward the enemy, the stallion turned toward a cluster of wounded Confederate soldiers who lay in the churned earth between the lines, abandoned by their retreating comrades and ignored by the advancing Union forces. Thunder picked his way carefully through the battlefield debris, stepping over discarded muskets and around the still forms of fallen soldiers. Colonel Marshall found himself in the surreal position of riding not toward battle, but toward mercy, guided by a horse who seemed to understand something that human commanders had forgotten in their calculations of victory and defeat. The first wounded Confederate soldier they reached was barely more than a boy, his grey uniform torn and bloodied, one leg twisted at an impossible angle beneath him. His eyes were glazed with pain and shock, but they focused on Marshall's blue uniform with a mixture of defiance and resignation. Don't leave me here," the young soldier whispered, his voice barely audible above the continuing sounds of battle. "Please." Marshall dismounted without hesitation, though every military instinct told him this was madness. He was an enemy officer in the middle of a battlefield, offering aid to Confederate wounded while the outcome of the engagement still hung in the balance. Yet Thunder's calm presence beside him seemed to create a bubble of peace in the midst of chaos. "What's your name, son?" Marshall asked, kneeling beside the wounded soldier and examining his injuries. "Private Thomas Whitman, sir. 15th Alabama." The boy tried to sit up, but fell back with a gasp of pain. My leg, ... I can't feel my leg. Lieutenant Hayes rode up behind them, his face a mask of confusion and concern. Colonel, what are we doing? This is what we should have been doing all along, Marshall replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. He began tearing strips from his own shirt to use as bandages. Help me get him stabilized. There are others. Indeed, there were many others. As thunder continued to move through the field of carnage, Marshall began to understand the full scope of the catastrophe that had befallen Lee's assault. Bodies lay scattered across the open ground like leaves after a storm, and among them the living wounded called out for water, for their mothers, for an end to their suffering. What struck Marshall most profoundly was how young they all were. Boys, really, who had left their farms and small towns to fight for causes they barely understood. Confederate and Union alike, they bled the same red blood and cried out with the same human voices. The political differences that had sent them to war seemed suddenly insignificant in the face of their shared mortality. A Union sergeant approached. Cautiously, his musket held ready but not quite aimed at the Confederate officer who was tending to enemy wounded. Sir, I don't understand. Are you surrendering? Marshall looked up from where he was binding a head wound on a Georgian private. I'm being human, Sergeant. Nothing more, nothing less. He gestured toward the scattered bodies around them. Look. At them, really look. They're someone's sons, someone's brothers. The war will go on tomorrow, but today they need help. The sergeant lowered his weapon slowly, his hard expression softening as he took in the scene. My orders are to secure prisoners, sir. Then secure them, Marshall replied, but secure them alive. Get stretcher bearers out here. Get the surgeons. These men are beyond fighting now. They're just human beings in need of aid. Word of what was happening spread quickly through both armies. Union soldiers began moving onto the field to collect their own wounded, and when they encountered Marshall tending to Confederate casualties, many stopped to help rather than interfere. The horror of what they had all witnessed seemed to have transcended the usual boundaries of military protocol. Thunder moved through it all like a guardian spirit, seeming to sense where help was most needed. The horse would pause beside a wounded man, nickering softly, drawing attention to those who might otherwise have been overlooked. It was as if the girl's song had awakened something in the animal that went beyond mere training or instinct. As the afternoon wore on, a remarkable thing began to happen. Confederate soldiers who had made it back to their own lines started returning to the field to help with their wounded. Union soldiers, instead of taking them prisoner, worked alongside them to carry the injured to field hospitals. The battlefield, which only hours before had been a killing ground, became a place of unprecedented cooperation. General George Gordon Meade himself rode out to see what was causing the unusual activity in no man's land. He found Colonel Marshall organizing an impromptu truce, with soldiers from both armies working together to save lives. The Union commander sat his horse in silent contemplation for several minutes before speaking. Colonel, this is highly irregular. Marshall stood and saluted, his uniform stained with blood and dirt. Yes, sir, I take full responsibility. Meade studied the scene around them, Union and Confederate soldiers sharing water, tearing up petticoats, 4 bandages, carrying wounded men, regardless of what color uniform they wore. Responsibility for what, Colonel? For remembering that we're all Americans. The general's words carried across the field, and a strange quiet fell over the area. Men who had been trying to kill each other that morning found themselves looking into each other's eyes and seeing not enemies, but fellow human beings caught up in something larger and more terrible than any of them had imagined. Thunder stood quietly beside Marshall, his presence somehow anchoring the moment in time. The horse's earlier refusal to charge now seemed like wisdom rather than cowardice. He had known somehow that this day would require a different kind of courage entirely. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson that seemed eerily appropriate for the day's events, the mysterious girl appeared again among the wounded. Marshall first caught sight of her moving between the makeshift stretchers, her ragged dress somehow clean despite the mud and blood that covered everything else on the field. She moved with the same gentle confidence she had shown with Thunder that morning, kneeling beside wounded soldiers and whispering words of comfort that seemed to ease their suffering in ways that morphine could not. Union and Confederate alike responded to her presence with a peace that transcended their physical pain, their faces relaxing as she spoke to them in that strange, ancient language Marshall had heard before. Lieutenant Hayes, his uniform now as stained and dirty as his colonel's, paused in his work of organizing stretcher-bearers to watch the girl. "Sir, there's something not quite right about her. I mean, she helps, but—" he trailed off, struggling to put his unease into words. Marshall understood what his aide was trying to express. The girl seemed to exist slightly apart from the world around her, as if she were present but not entirely bound by the same rules that governed everyone else. Soldiers she spoke with often looked around afterward with confused expressions, as if they couldn't quite remember what she had said, only that they felt better for having heard it. "She's exactly what we need," Marshall replied, watching as the girl approached a dying Confederate major who had been crying out for his wife. Her song seemed to transport the man somewhere else entirely, his pain-racked features smoothing into an expression of wonder and peace. "Maybe she's what we've always needed." The work of mercy continued through the afternoon, with more soldiers from both armies joining the effort to save the wounded. Field hospitals on both sides of the line began to fill with men who bore the uniforms of their enemies, but the surgeons worked on them all with equal dedication. The normal rules of war seemed suspended in the face of the overwhelming human need that surrounded them. General Robert Edward Lee himself appeared on the field as the shadows grew longer, riding slowly among the wounded with an expression of profound sorrow. The Confederate commander dismounted near where Marshall was helping to load a Union corporal onto a stretcher, and for a moment the two officers, one Northern, one Southern, stood facing each other in silence. "This was not how I envisioned this day would end," Lee said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command and the burden of countless decisions that had led to this moment. Marshall straightened, unsure of the protocol for addressing an enemy. "General, under these extraordinary circumstances—" "No, sir. I imagine none of us did." Lee's eyes swept across the field, taking in the sight of soldiers from both armies working together. "Perhaps this is how it should have ended long ago. Perhaps this is what we should have been doing instead of... He gestured toward the distant sound of continued skirmishing, where the more conventional aspects of the battle continued. The girl appeared beside them, as if she had materialized from the evening air itself. Both generals turned to look at her, and Marshall was struck by the way she seemed to command their attention despite her small stature and humble appearance. "The fighting will continue," she said simply, addressing both men with equal directness. "But something has changed here today, something that will echo through the years long after the cannons fall silent." Lee studied her with the intensity of a man who had spent his life reading the character of others. "Who are you, child?" "I am the one who sings for those who can no longer sing for themselves," she replied. The same answer she had given Marshall that morning, though it seemed to carry additional weight now. "I am the one who remembers that before they were soldiers, they were all someone's children." Thunder approached the group, moving with the same ethereal quality that seemed to surround the girl. The horse nuzzled Marshall's shoulder gently, then turned his attention to Lee, showing no recognition of military rank or political allegiance, only the acknowledgement of one living being for another. "Your horse has wisdom," Lee observed, reaching out to stroke Thunder's neck. He knew that today would require something different than what we had planned. Marshall nodded, finally beginning to understand the full significance of Thunder's earlier refusal to move. He was trying to tell me that there's more than one way to serve with honor. As the evening deepened and the last of the wounded were being carried from the field, the girl began to sing again. This time, her voice carried clearly across the entire area, reaching the ears of soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Melody was the same one she had used to calm Thunder that morning, but now it seemed to encompass all the pain and sorrow and hope of the day. Men who had spent the afternoon in acts of mercy found themselves humming along with her song, though none of them could have said where they had learned the tune. It seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory, from a place in the human heart that remembered what it meant to care for one another. Regardless of the artificial divisions that politics and war created, the Battle of Gettysburg would continue into the night and be remembered as a turning point in the American Civil War. But for those who had worked on the field that afternoon, something else had changed as well. They had rediscovered their common humanity in the midst of humanity's greatest failure, and that discovery would stay with them long after the war ended. Dawn broke on July 4th, 1863, revealing a battlefield transformed not only by the carnage of the previous day, but by the extraordinary acts of compassion that had followed. Colonel Marshall stood beside Thunder, both of them exhausted from their night of work among the wounded, watching as the last of General Lee's army began its retreat toward Virginia. The girl was still there, moving like a gentle spirit among the remaining casualties, her song now reduced to a soft humming that seemed to blend with the morning breeze. As Marshall watched, she approached a young Union soldier who had lost his arm in the fighting, kneeling beside his stretcher to whisper words of comfort that made the boy smile despite his pain. Lieutenant Hayes, his face aged beyond his years by what he had witnessed, joined his colonel at the stone wall that had marked the high water mark of the Confederate assault. "Sir, the regimental roster shows 43 men who participated in the rescue efforts yesterday. 43 soldiers who chose mercy over military glory." Marshall nodded, understanding the significance of that number. In the grand sweep of history, 43 men seemed insignificant compared to the thousands who had fought and died over the 3 days of battle. But sometimes he was beginning to realize the most important changes came not from great armies, but from small acts of courage by individuals who chose to do what was right rather than what was expected. And they all heard the song. Hayes continued quietly. Every one of them mentioned it in their reports. A girl singing to calm the horses, they said, though they couldn't quite remember the words. Thunder turned his head at the mention of the song, his ears pricking forward as if he could still hear echoes of the melody that had transformed him from a reluctant warhorse into an instrument of mercy. The stallion had changed during their day on the battlefield, becoming something more than just a cavalry mount. He had become a symbol of the possibility that even in war, there could be moments of transcendent humanity. General Meade approached them as the morning sun climbed higher, his staff trailing behind him as he made his rounds of the battlefield. The general's face bore the marks of a man who had just commanded in one of the bloodiest battles in American history. But there was something else there too, a kind of wonder that spoke to what he had witnessed the previous afternoon. "Colonel Marshal," Meade said, dismounting to stand beside the stone wall, "I've been thinking about what happened here yesterday, about what you and your men did." Marshall straightened to attention, uncertain whether he was about to be commended or court-martialed for his unprecedented actions. "Sir, I take full responsibility for," Meade held up a hand to stop him, "for reminding us why we're fighting this war in the first place." The general's eyes swept across the field where soldiers from both armies had worked together to save lives. "We're not fighting to destroy each other, Colonel. We're fighting to preserve something precious, the idea that all men are created equal, that we can be better than our worst impulses." The girl approached them as if summoned by the general's words, her presence once again creating that strange sense of peace that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She looked up at Meade with those ancient eyes and smiled. "You understand," she said simply. "That's why the song will continue." Meade knelt to bring himself to her eye level, his expression gentle despite the weight of command he carried. "What song, child?" "The one that reminds us who we really are," she replied. "The one that calls us back to our better angels when we've forgotten how to listen." She reached out and placed her small hand on Thunder's muzzle, and the horse nickered softly in response. "It will echo through the years, carried by those who remember that courage can take many forms." As the morning progressed and the armies began to separate, Lee's forces retreating southward and Meade's preparing to follow, the girl began to fade like morning mist. She didn't walk away or disappear suddenly. She simply became less substantial, as if she were returning to whatever realm had sent her to them in their hour of greatest need. But her song remained. Marshall could hear it in the way Thunder's hooves struck the ground as they finally began to move forward. Hayes hummed it unconsciously as he organized the regiment for their pursuit of Lee's army. The wounded soldiers in the field hospitals sang it in their delirium, and the surgeons found themselves working to its rhythm as they fought to save lives. Years later, when the war was over and the nation began the long process of healing, those who had been on the battlefield at Gettysburg would remember the girl with ragged shoes who had sung to the horses. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the day when enemies became helpers, when a stubborn horse led his rider to discover that the greatest victory was not in conquest, but in compassion. The Battle of Gettysburg would be remembered for many things, for Pickett's charge, for the courage of soldiers on both sides, for being the turning point of the Civil War. But for those who had lived through July 3rd, 1863, it would also be remembered as the day when a mysterious girl's song reminded them that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, the light of mercy could still shine through Dot. Thunder carried Colonel Marshall off the field that morning, but he carried something else as well, the memory of a song that would echo through American history, reminding future generations that true courage sometimes means laying down arms instead of taking them up, that the greatest battles are often fought not against enemies but against the darkness within ourselves, and that sometimes when a horse refuses to move, it might be because he's listening to the better angels of his nature. The girl was gone, but her song would never truly end. It would live on in every act of mercy, every choice to heal rather than harm. Every moment when people chose to see their common humanity instead of their differences. And somewhere in the hills of Pennsylvania, if you listened carefully on quiet mornings when the mist clung to the earth, you might still hear the echo of an ancient melody, sung by a girl with ragged shoes who taught a nation that the most powerful weapon against hatred is a gentle song of love.